Alright, so this past weekend I finally got to see the newest addition in the Scream franchise, Scream 2022, or Scream 5, or whatever the hell you want to call it. The latest sequel, the latest reboot, the latest requel in the franchise. And this is a movie that I've been very excited to talk about, because as anybody following me knows, I already got to talk a little bit about Halloween. I've obviously talked extensively about Friday the 13th. And this is my first opportunity and first excuse to talk about another one of my favorite horror franchises, Scream. And of course, like so many of you watching, the first Scream is a movie that I absolutely adore. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Or I guess I should say, one of my favorite scary movies of all time.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Well, this is awkward. Halloween.
I'll gut you like a fish, understand?
Alright, chill, you're pretty far up there, Ghostface, damn. Anyways, the original Scream is absolutely one of my top 3 horror movies of all time, and it came at the perfect time for the genre. You had some great horror in the 70s, in the 80s with the practical effects of The Thing, even The Fly with Jeff Goldblum. But the early 90s was a rough time for horror as a genre. It was definitely on a downward trajectory, and a lot of people were worried that the genre was dying completely. But in comes this new project from Wes Craven that totally broke the fourth wall, was self-aware, that made fun of the classic slasher horror tropes, and it was such a refreshing movie for audiences, which is why it worked so well.
Never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back. I'll be right back!
But this was certainly a movie that the horror genre desperately needed, and it will always hold a special place in my heart. And with that being said, with each trailer of the new Scream movie, I was definitely getting more and more excited. But me, forever being the skeptic, I also had a few concerns. Now obviously this is the first movie in the franchise to not have Wes Craven in the director's chair, as he unfortunately passed away back in 2015. While Kevin Williamson was given a producer credit for this movie, he was not a writer in this project. So you already have a new director and a new writer. That was enough to get me a little worried. But on top of that, I also heard a lot of speculation and a lot of rumors that this movie might lean more into a serious slasher film and get away from the meta, self-aware nature that made Scream what it is. And while I think in a certain way, it could have been interesting if executed properly, it also would have been a very bold move to take such a well-respected and beloved franchise from a legend like Wes Craven and just completely change the tone. You're definitely inviting a ton of criticism if it flops. So was this movie more serious than its predecessors? Well, no. To alleviate any worries right out of the gate as far as that goes, this movie is definitely still very self-aware and very meta. Did I enjoy it? Yeah, let's talk about that. And before we go any further, this will have spoilers in it. I'm gonna also put it in the title, but if you haven't seen the movie, I would heavily advise you watch that before you come back and check out this review. So this is your first and only warning. So, Scream takes place 25 years after the original murders in Woodsboro, when a new Ghostface...
Oh man, am I fucking stoned.
No, not that Ghostface.
I'm gonna slash and gash, cut another hole in your ass. I spill blood on the walls and play tennis with your balls.
Anyways, when a new Ghostface emerges, Sidney Prescott returns to her hometown to figure out who's donning the mask and what their motives are. Wait, you know what? I'm not gonna lie to you by giving you some generic summary of the movie. The truth is, Sidney Prescott is barely in this. She serves as more of a third act legacy role to simply pass the torch. And going into this, I've watched and read a ton of other reviews, and based on what I've seen, I have a very unpopular opinion as far as this movie goes. So let's start on a high note and talk about some of the good things with the newest Scream.
And here we go.
So my first positive, and this is pretty important, I would say Ghostface is great in this movie. Whenever the killer is in costume, I have no issues there. He, or she, or they, have some brutal kills. And even if they're not the most creative, this killer has never really been known for his creative kills, It's always kind of been just like stab, stab, stab. So I definitely can't take away points from the movie there, but some of these kills are damn brutal. Just the movements and the mannerisms were really spot on. In that regard, you could tell the people making this movie really had a lot of love and respect for the source material. So Ghostface was really good. My next positive is that Dewey plays a huge part in this movie, and what we get from him is awesome. As far as legacy characters go, he is far and away the best of the big three. You know, we really don't get like the jokey, playful version of Dewey that we're used to. Instead, we have this character that has this traumatic past, and he's dealing with losing the woman that he loved. He was just much more grounded this time around, and that worked for me 100%. Although he did have the occasional joke he would throw in there that reminds you why you loved him so much in the first place. While being more serious, he still has some of the best comedic moments in the movie. I was just genuinely impressed with David Arquette's performance here, which is not something I normally say. I do enjoy him, but I don't think anybody really considers him an A-list actor. But in his defense, you would never know it from watching this movie. He is excellent. And then aside from a few moments that drag a little bit in the second act, this movie I thought was really well paced. There was never a point where I found myself to be bored while watching it. And although I didn't love everything that was happening on screen, at least something was happening. And at the end of the day, even if I don't necessarily love every aspect, I would still prefer to have a story that flows than to have a movie that I'm not enjoying while also being terribly paced. So that's something. Now, with that out of the way, I want to ask you a serious question. What am I missing here? Like seriously, this isn't even part of the video anymore. I'm literally asking a question. Because everybody seems to adore this movie. And honestly, I just didn't. Like, what did I not see? Or what am I missing? Do you know? Do you?
Do you? Do you? Do you?
Like, while it got a few things right, to me it just got so much more wrong. And the things that they missed on, they weren't just like these little hiccups or missteps that I could work around. They took me out of the movie. Like to a point that I was sitting beside these people that I met at the theater, and we were laughing at how bad some of these moments were. Alright, now for those of you who didn't immediately click off after what I just said, let's get into some of the negatives here, and I'll try to defend my point. And my first negative is gonna be that I absolutely hated these new characters. And I fully understand the movies can't always be about Sydney, Dewey, and Gale. At some point, the torch does have to be passed, but these are not the people to pass the torch to. There were a few characters that I genuinely enjoyed, but those characters were either killed by Ghostface, or in one case, they were Ghostface. So pretty much all the characters I liked died. And what we were left with are these two sisters that I just don't give a shit about. I don't want to say they were bad actresses necessarily. For whatever reason, it didn't work for me. And to keep it brief, I'll just say that if there's a new trilogy centered around them, I don't really have much excitement for that trilogy. And it didn't even bother me with the angle of Sam being the daughter of Billy Loomis. What did rub me the wrong way is when you see his ghost like throughout the movie. Like literally in the third act at some points he's like showing her the way. To me it felt like Luke talking to Obi-Wan's Force ghost, or Egon Spangler coming back to help the Ghostbusters. And in those cases it worked. But it just doesn't belong in a horror movie series like this. Like the story doesn't change one bit if you leave these moments out. And a lot of these newer requel movies are guilty of this, so let's just call it what it is. This was them finding an excuse to force in one more legacy character. Next, and let me know in the comments if you did the same thing, but I called the killer in this movie like in the first 15 minutes, or at least one of the killers. As soon as Richie said that he had never seen the Stab movies and he wasn't familiar with the films or these murders, I'm like, yep, it's 100% that guy. Like they tried to incorporate this whodunit in the third act, which I don't fault them for. That's what this franchise is known for. But while the original Scream and even Scream 2 pulled it off in a way that I enjoyed and it really kept me guessing, it was just way too overdone here, especially in the third act. And then speaking of that third act, this movie is almost like a complete shot-for-shot ripoff of the original Scream's third act. And I know some people are gonna be like, oh, that's the whole ironic point. Come up with your own thing.
Can we all do it?
No, Andy, it's a snowball fight.
It's not fun. Go get your own thing. Beat it.
It even gets to the point where you have Mindy on the couch watching Scream, and she's telling Jamie Kennedy to turn around. And of course, Ghostface comes up behind her on the couch. You have one of the killers come back for one final scare. And it even takes place in the same exact house. The third act of this movie takes place in Stu Macher's house. Like, am I crazy? Or would this have not been the perfect place to put in a little third act twist here? Because we're all expecting two killers. We're all expecting one of the sisters to get away and use Ghostface's own tricks against him. And I don't know, if they would have done something here to subvert our expectations, to me that would have worked beautifully. I'm not saying they have to do something as extreme as bringing back Stu as the third killer, but give us something different. Like maybe bringing back Stu as the third killer. Alright, that one was just for me.
Yeah, Billy, you cut me too deep. I think I'm dying here, man.
Hello?
I already touched on this next point briefly in my intro, but I really wish Sydney and Gale would have been given more to do here. And my biggest issue isn't even the fact that they weren't used a lot, but it was more in the marketing and the way that the trailers misled the audience. Like, based on the trailers, this movie seemed like Sidney Prescott coming back home to confront Ghostface, and all these other characters were just kind of gonna be in the background. But that's not the case at all here. Sidney's in this movie for maybe 20 minutes. And speaking of legacy characters, I was so pissed at the way they killed Dewey. I don't have an issue that they killed him. I actually think that added some weight to this film, but he deserved a better death. It always makes me angry in movies when a character dies from these stupid little things like a noise that distracts them just long enough for the killer to make a move. But especially for somebody like Dewey, who's been dealing with this stuff for 25 years, and it's a character that we love. I think as far as a death sequence goes, they did my boy real dirty in this movie. And then lastly, I am glad they stuck with the self-aware nature that made these movies so great in the first place. But I don't think these writers have ever heard the expression, too much of a good thing. And I never thought I would say this about a Scream movie, but there's just a little too much meta humor in this film. It got to the point where it was nostalgic, and then it was still kind of funny, and then it just got ridiculous and annoying by the third act. And yes, I'm fully aware that the original Scream was loaded with this same kind of humor, but that was also in 1996, when nothing like this had ever been done before, so it felt fresh and it felt really entertaining. Whereas this movie, I feel like it would have been more effective if they just used it a little more sparingly. But overall, as a horror comedy, this is a perfectly fine movie. You could go to the theater and have a good time with it. But as a reboot or a requel of one of my favorite horror franchises of all time, this left me feeling a little disappointed. Aside from Dewey and Richie, most of the comedy didn't land for me. It felt a little bit overdone. And for this being a scary movie, it's really not all that scary. Like, if you take out the cheap jump scares, nothing here really left me on the edge of my seat. But with all that being said, I still wouldn't say I hated this movie. I had a good enough time with it. And who knows, maybe subconsciously, this type of campy, over-the-top horror will just never work in a 2022 setting the way it worked for me so well in the late 90s and early 2000s. But I will say it was a hell of a lot better than the last horror movie I had sky-high expectations for.
Evil dies tonight!
Evil dies tonight!
So if the original Scream for me is an 8.5 or a 9, depending on how I'm feeling that day, I'm gonna give Scream 2022 a 6.5 out of 10. Still a good movie. So what did you think of Scream 2022? Are you with the vast majority of audiences that absolutely adore this movie, say it's the greatest thing since the original Scream, which I disagree with? Are you like me that had a good enough time with it, but it ultimately left you feeling a little disappointed? Or did you actually hate this movie? Let me know down in the comments. And also let me know, what's your favorite scary movie? I had to ask, right? And while I have you, me and a couple friends have recently launched a pop culture podcast called Culture Shocked. Link for that is down in the description. If you're a podcast person, give it a download and a listen, give us a rating on there, and let me know in the comments what you thought of it. And as always, if you enjoyed this, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing right over here so you don't miss any future content. And if you want to see other stuff like this, other reviews, rankings, tier lists, you can find some of those right over here. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.